The kitchen light cast its harsh glow across the dining table that served as my desk, illuminating spreadsheets I'd printed out 2 days ago and hadn't bothered to organize properly. Papers overlapped each other in chaotic layers, each one marked with handwritten notes in the margins, observations, questions, connections I'd drawn between lines of text that most people would never think to link together. My coffee cup sat abandoned somewhere in the pile, half full, and growing a film on its surface that I didn't want to examine too closely. The house around me held the particular stillness of late evening in autumn. Not the peaceful silence of rest, but the kind that comes from prolonged isolation, where the absence of other human voices becomes so complete that you forget what interruption actually sounds like. The refrigerator hummed its low, constant note from the kitchen. Outside, somewhere in the darkness of the suburban Chicago landscape, a dog barked once and then stopped, as if reconsidering the effort required to continue. I'd been awake for 16 hours, maybe 17. The distinction had become meaningless sometime around noon, when I'd skipped lunch in favor of following a financial thread that had started to make unexpected sense. My eyes felt gritty, that specific sensation of strained vision that comes from hours of screen time, but the work was too close to completion for sleep to matter now. Richetti kept appearing in places he shouldn't be. Not directly. No obvious signature or naming convention that screamed organized crime. But the pattern was there if you knew how to read the gaps between transactions. 3 shell corporations in Delaware. 2 investment groups registered through Byzantine corporate structures that obscured their actual ownership. And woven through everything like a thread stitched through silk, financial movements that connected Renaissance Biologics to entities that had no legitimate reason to exist. Renaissance Biologics was supposed to be a clean operation. Biotech company in downtown Chicago, founded 15 years ago by 2 former pharmaceutical researchers with Stanford credentials, and everything that looked like authentic entrepreneurial success. Their research focused on protein compound development. Nothing exotic. Nothing that would attract attention from the kind of people who dealt in shadows and untraceable money. Yet 6 months ago, their entire trajectory had accelerated. Patent applications that should have taken 2 years moved through the system in 8 weeks. Regulatory approvals that typically required exhaustive clinical trials somehow manifested with minimal oversight. And the funding that made all of this possible arrived from sources that dissolved under examination, leaving only the faint trace of a name that shouldn't exist in legitimate business contexts. Richetti. I'd first encountered it while cross-referencing financial documents from a minor embezzlement case 3 months ago. The name had appeared once in a document I wasn't even supposed to access. A footnote in a footnote, mentioned only in passing by someone who clearly didn't realize they were documenting anything significant. I'd filed it away in that part of my mind, where stray details accumulate, waiting to be useful. Then, while pursuing the Renaissance story, there it was again. Not once, but 7 times across documents spanning the past 18 months. Each appearance was carefully disguised within corporate jargon and financial terminology. Each one was deliberately buried among thousands of other transactions. But if you followed the thread backward through the Delaware formations and into the investment structures that preceded them, they all led to that name. A ghost attached to real money, real infrastructure, real stakes. I'd called Detective Stevens on a Wednesday morning, catching him at his desk before he'd had time to disappear into interrogation rooms or fieldwork. "I need information on something," I'd said without preamble. Stevens and I had moved past the pleasantries years ago. "And why would I help you with that?" His voice carried the perpetual exhaustion of someone who had seen too many versions of human failure and decided that skepticism was the only rational response. "Because I might have something that connects to organized crime, and you work organized crime, and we have an arrangement." There was a pause. I could hear him breathing, could imagine him sitting at whatever desk they'd assigned him in whichever precinct he was currently stationed. Stevens and I didn't meet in person. We conducted our transactions through phone calls and encrypted messages, maintaining the professional distance that allowed both of us to claim plausible deniability if anyone ever asked the wrong questions. "What name?" he finally asked. "Richetti." The silence that followed was different from the pause before. This was the silence of someone recalibrating their entire assessment of a conversation. When Stevens spoke again, His voice had shifted into a register that I recognized as something between warning and threat. "You need to be very careful with that," he said quietly. "That's not a casual connection." Connection to what? To people who don't appreciate being investigated. I'd ended the call shortly after, having extracted from Stevens the minimal reassurance that he would check his databases and see what resources he could access without drawing attention. The conversation had left me unsettled in a way that wasn't entirely unfamiliar. There was always a moment in research like this when you realized you might have crossed from academic investigation into something with actual consequences. But I'd learned to recognize that moment and compartmentalize it. The fear was important, the acknowledgement that I was playing in deeper waters than academic journalism. But fear couldn't be the thing that stopped me. Not after everything I'd already sacrificed in pursuit of stories that didn't pan out. Sources that disappeared. Career trajectories that had broken under the weight of a single mistake made years ago. My parents had called repeatedly during the first year after the newspaper article that wasn't published. My mother left voicemails about networking, about finding positions at magazines that didn't require investigation, about whether I'd considered going back to school for something more practical. My father had sent emails with subject lines like long-term career planning and your future options, couched in the neutral language of someone who had learned to discuss unpleasant things without actually engaging with them emotionally. After the second year, the calls had become sporadic. After the third year, I'd stopped answering even when they did come through. Now we existed in a state of distant civility, connected through family obligation rather than actual relationship. The last real conversation with my mother had been 8 months ago, a brief phone call where she'd asked if I was still in Chicago and I'd said yes, and we'd both run out of things to discuss almost immediately. That distance felt safer than active conflict. Conflict required engagement. Safety was just the quiet acknowledgement that we no longer understood each other's choices. The house I rented was old enough that you could hear the small sounds of its age, the settling of wood, the occasional groan of pipes responding to shifts in temperature. It was a 2-story structure on a tree-lined street in a suburb that had probably been farmland 50 years ago, before development pushed outward from Chicago's core, converting agricultural land into neat residential lots, where people like me could afford to rent small pieces of isolation. The monthly rent was $1,800, which was sustainable through a combination of freelance articles, consulting work for corporate investigators, and the occasional bounty from publications that still believed in paying for genuine investigative journalism. I'd chosen it specifically because it was quiet, and because the landlord didn't ask questions. The living room faced a street that saw minimal traffic. The backyard was overgrown enough that neighbors couldn't easily see through the tangle of growth. The kitchen had a door that led to a small porch where you could stand without being visible from most angles. It was a house designed by someone who understood the value of privacy, and I'd rented it with the intention of maintaining exactly that. 2 years later, I still barely knew the names of the people living on either side of the property. My laptop sat open in front of me, the screen bright in the surrounding darkness. I hadn't bothered to turn on more than one light in the house. There was something about working in minimal illumination that actually helped my concentration. The direct light on the screen, everything else in shadow, created a kind of tunnel vision that was useful for focused research. Around me, the suburban evening continued its quiet progression. Somewhere a car drove past. Somewhere else, someone's television flickered in a window 3 houses down. The world outside my circle of light operated according to rhythms I barely registered anymore. I pulled up the most recent documents I'd acquired. Financial records from Renaissance Biologics that had taken me 2 weeks to extract through sources I'd cultivated over years of reporting. The records themselves weren't classified, just difficult to access without direct corporate access or significant persuasion. I'd used persuasion, which had mostly consisted of talking to a junior accountant who worked for the company, and convinced her that transparency was ultimately a moral good, and that the specific documents I needed wouldn't actually harm anyone if released. The thread was becoming clearer. I could see the architecture of it now, the way money had moved through channels designed to obscure rather than to hide, since actual hiding wasn't possible if you knew where to look. The investment that had accelerated Renaissance's development timeline had come from a structure that wasn't Ricchetti's name directly, but was controlled by entities that traced back to corporate formations where Richetti appeared in registration documents as a managing member. So either Richetti was a legitimate businessman making unconventional investment choices, or Richetti was involved in something that required the investment to be obscured. Stevens's reaction suggested the latter, but Stevens's reaction to the name had also been weighted with enough caution that I understood I was approaching territory where the standard rules of journalism might not apply. That was the moment where most people would have stopped, where the smart choice would have been to close the laptop, delete the files, pretend I'd never made the connection. The smart choice would have been to acknowledge that some stories weren't worth the personal cost of pursuing them. I'd made the smart choice once before, and it hadn't protected me. The article I'd refused to publish had been published anyway by someone else. The sources I'd been careful to protect had been exposed anyway. The career I'd tried to preserve by exercising restraint had ended anyway. So I'd learned that restraint didn't actually function as a protective measure. It just meant that other people got to decide the terms of your failure. The kitchen showed no signs of activity. The house was mine alone, and had been for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have another person moving through these spaces. There had been someone, a few years ago. Another journalist who'd seemed to understand the specific insanity of pursuing stories that most people had already forgotten about. He'd lasted 8 months before deciding that my obsession with work made me impossible to actually build something with. He was right, which had almost made the failure worse. Being wrong would have given me grounds to argue. Being right meant accepting that the choice between connection and work had always been a binary one, and I'd chosen poorly. My phone sat on the table beside my laptop. I'd turned off notifications years ago, finding that the constant interruptions of digital communication interfered with focus. I checked it occasionally, usually out of obligation rather than any actual expectation that someone would have reached out. Today was no different. The screen showed nothing new, nothing unexpected. My mother's contact information was still there in the call history, that last number from 8 months ago that I'd let go to voicemail while I was working on something that felt more important at the time. The research had consumed most of the afternoon. I'd followed the financial thread through its various manifestations, each one leading to the next, each one becoming incrementally more suspicious in its structure. There was a moment around 5 in the evening when I'd stopped to realize I hadn't eaten anything since yesterday morning. The realization was abstract, registering as a concept rather than as physical hunger. My body would feed itself if I ignored it long enough. Eventually, the sensation would pass, replaced by a different kind of focus that came with fasting, a clarity that made certain types of analysis easier. But around 9 in the evening, as I was deep into cross-referencing institutional investors with criminal databases I had access to through Stevens and other sources, my stomach had decided to make its presence known in a way that couldn't be ignored. I'd stood up from the table too quickly, felt the momentary dizziness that comes from prolonged sitting, and had made my way to the kitchen where I'd opened my phone and accessed the food delivery application I used occasionally. The Thai restaurant I selected was called Siam Street. It was 3 miles away, which meant delivery would take approximately 30 minutes. I ordered the pad krapao gai, the dish I'd been craving without consciously registering that I was craving it. Ground chicken with basil, an egg fried on top, rice. The simplicity of it was part of the appeal. There was no effort required in eating it, no complicated flavors that demanded attention. It was fuel that happened to taste like something from a time in my life when things had made more sense, when I'd been in Boston with my mother in a small restaurant she liked, both of us eating the same dish, both of us comfortable in the way that only happens when you've stopped trying to prove anything to each other. I'd placed the order. I'd selected the option to leave the food at the door. I'd confirmed the payment, an amount that felt excessive for the meal, but that I was too tired to dispute. The application had estimated delivery at 9:47 p.m. I'd had time to return to my research, to lose myself in documents and financial data and the architecture of something that was beginning to look like a genuine criminal enterprise operating under the veneer of legitimate commerce. At 9:33 p.m., I was deep enough in the work that the outside world had become abstract. The house was quiet around me. The kitchen light continued its harsh illumination. The documents on the table in front of me had started to form patterns that my subconscious mind had recognized before my conscious thoughts had caught up. There was something here, something significant enough that it couldn't be dismissed as coincidence or academic interest. There was a story that mattered, and I was one of the few people positioned to tell it. The rain had started sometime after 9, beginning as a light patter against the windows and gradually building in intensity. Chicago was heading into the season where weather became dramatic, where afternoon showers could transform into evening deluges without warning. I'd barely registered the change, too focused on the work in front of me to pay attention to meteorological shifts. The sound of it was just ambient noise, something that existed in the background of my concentration without actually penetrating it. At 9:47 p.m., I was expecting the arrival of the delivery driver. I had mentally cleared space for the 15-minute interruption that eating would require, and then I would return to the work. The night was young enough that I could reasonably expect to spend at least another 4 hours pursuing these connections, seeing where else they led, beginning to construct the narrative that might eventually become the story I was building toward. I had no way of knowing that the approaching vehicle wasn't a delivery driver at all. The sound came without warning, a screech of tires meeting wet asphalt with too much force, followed by the hollow percussion of metal colliding with something immobile. The impact was sudden enough that my concentration fractured completely, my hands stilled on the keyboard. For a moment, I didn't move, processing what I'd heard and trying to determine whether it had been inside my head or outside in the world beyond the walls of my house. Another sound confirmed it was external. A muffled shout, male, carrying the particular quality of someone responding to shock rather than pain. I pushed away from the table, the chair scraping backward with a noise that seemed louder than it should have. The rain had intensified while I'd been working, transforming from gentle percussion into something more aggressive, more present. It drummed against the roof and the windows with a rhythm that had an almost hostile quality to it. I moved toward the front window, the one that faced the street where the delivery driver would presumably arrive. What I saw through the glass was a scene that didn't immediately make sense, not because it was obscure, but because my brain took a moment to catalog the elements correctly. There was a vehicle in the street, a Maserati, sleek and black, and worth more money than I made in a year. Its front end was crumpled against the utility pole that had stood on the corner since I'd moved in, a fixture so unremarkable that I rarely consciously registered its existence. Beyond the Maserati, I could see a motorcycle scattered across the intersection, its rider nowhere immediately visible. The driver's door of the Maserati opened, with the kind of deliberateness that suggested the person inside was moving with absolute control, despite whatever had just transpired. A man emerged. Even from this distance, even through the distortion of rain against glass and the dimness of the suburban night, I could assess certain facts about him. He was tall. He moved with a precision that indicated military training or its equivalent. His suit, despite the collision and the rain, maintained its structure and shape, as if the expensive tailoring had been engineered to withstand exactly this kind of chaos. I should have looked away, should have retreated to my kitchen, locked the doors, and pretended I hadn't witnessed whatever was unfolding on my quiet suburban street. Instead, I found myself remaining at the window, watching as the man approached the figure on the ground. There was a delivery bag lying in the street, its contents scattered. I recognized it as being from the restaurant I'd ordered from. The food I'd been expecting now transformed into debris. The man was checking the condition of the person on the ground, and even from this distance, I could see that whoever it was had a serious injury. The angle of one leg was wrong, fundamentally wrong in the way that indicated broken bone rather than simple collision trauma. The man straightened, and without any hesitation or apparent consultation, he pulled out his phone. His conversation was brief. I couldn't hear the words through the glass and rain, but the cadence and intensity suggested authority. People were being summoned. Things were being arranged. Within minutes, 2 vehicles arrived from directions that suggested they'd been waiting nearby. The occupants moved with the same precise efficiency as the man with the Maserati. One of them took the injured driver, while the man with the Maserati remained in the street, staring at the wrecked motorcycle and then at the utility pole as if assessing damage and responsibility through sheer force of will. That was when I realized he was looking directly at my house. I stepped back from the window, though I wasn't sure he could actually see me through the darkness inside and the rain outside. My heart rate had accelerated, though I couldn't have articulated exactly why. An accident. Someone had an accident on my street. Nothing about that necessarily involved me, or required any response from me beyond simply acknowledging that such events occurred in the world without warning. But the man was walking toward my house now. His suit jacket was soaked through. His dark hair was plastered against his skull by rain, and he moved with the kind of intention that suggested he'd already decided where he was going and saw no point in delaying arrival. He was carrying the delivery bag. My delivery bag. I moved away from the window toward the front door, my mind cycling through a series of possible scenarios, none of which made complete sense. The rational explanation was that the collision had damaged my food delivery, and this man, whoever he was, had decided to deliver it personally as a courtesy or an apology, or simply because the infrastructure for that delivery had already been set in motion, and following through was the simplest path forward. The rational explanation and my actual intuition were having a substantial disagreement. When the knock came, it wasn't the gentle tap of a delivery driver attempting not to disturb a household at nearly 10 in the evening. It was authoritative, controlled. The knock of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him. I didn't open it immediately. I stood in the hallway, hand hovering near the deadbolt, trying to assess the situation through the closed wooden barrier. The porch light I'd forgotten to turn on suddenly became a significant regret. I couldn't see him clearly, just the outline of his shape against the darkness and rain outside. "Yes?" I called through the door, my voice steady despite the fact that my nervous system was sending conflicting signals about what kind of danger assessment was actually warranted here. "I have your food delivery," the man said. His voice was low and carried an accent that placed him somewhere in the Italian demographic, though the precise origin was difficult to determine. "There was an incident. I brought your order to completion." The phrasing was unusual, formal. Something about the way he'd constructed the sentence suggested someone for whom English was a second language, but who spoke it with absolute precision anyway. I opened the door, though I didn't open it fully. Just enough to see him, and more importantly, to let him see that opening it completely remained within my control. The crack was sufficient to observe details I'd missed from a distance. His eyes were a brown so dark they appeared almost black, but there was an intensity behind them that made the actual color less relevant than the intelligence looking outward from them. His jaw was sharp, defined by the kind of bone structure that suggested ancestry that had been proud of its appearance and had maintained that pride through generations. There was a scar along his left cheekbone, thin and precise, the kind of mark that came from either violence or surgery, and spoke to a life where such marks accumulated without particular emotional attachment. "Thank you," I said, and the words felt inadequate, though I couldn't have articulated why. He held out the delivery bag. It was damp, but intact. The food inside would likely be salvageable, though the specific qualities that had made it appealing 20 minutes ago had probably degraded. "There will be no charge. The restaurant will understand the situation." I took the bag, and in that moment of transfer, I became acutely aware of the physical presence of him. He was large in a way that made the porch feel suddenly smaller. The rain had soaked through his suit completely, and I could see the outline of his body beneath the fabric in a way that suggested muscle density that came from deliberate training rather than casual fitness. "What happened?" I asked, though the answer seemed obvious. "Motorcycle accident, collision, injury." The man had responded and was now engaged in the kind of follow-up conduct that fell somewhere between citizen responsibility and something else that I didn't quite want to examine too closely. "A driver made an error in judgment," he said. "It's been addressed. Your food was in the vicinity of the incident. I decided to ensure its delivery was completed." The way he said "addressed" suggested that addressing it had involved more than simply calling emergency services and providing a statement to police. But his tone made it clear that elaboration wasn't on offer. "Well," I said, searching for something appropriate to say in this situation that had no precedent in my experience. "Thank you for that." He looked at me for a moment longer than felt comfortable, his dark eyes moving across my face with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he was reading information the way I read financial documents. Cataloging, cross-referencing, processing. "You're welcome," he finally said. "I live in this territory. I ensure certain standards are maintained." The word territory hung between us. It was not a word that most people used casually. Territory was something that belonged to animals, or to countries, or to crime organizations in movies and television shows. It was not a word that a well-dressed Italian man in an expensive soaked suit typically employed when discussing a quiet suburban neighborhood in Chicago. Well, I said again, because my vocabulary seemed to have contracted significantly. I appreciate it. Gabriel entered my house the way someone enters a space that belongs to them by right of conquest. Not aggressive, but unbothered by any question of whether his presence was warranted. He brought the evening cold with him, the rain having soaked through his suit, to the point that water pooled slightly on my hardwood floor where he stood. His dark hair was plastered against his skull, and there was something almost unsettling about how completely unfazed he appeared to be dripping water onto my threshold. I found myself acutely aware of every inadequacy in my immediate surroundings. The research papers scattered across my dining table, the empty coffee cup with its film of oxidized caffeine, the general state of disarray that came from someone who prioritized information gathering over basic housekeeping. He looked at these things without judgment, which somehow felt worse than if he'd been openly critical. "The food," he said, still holding the delivery bag that had somehow survived its involvement in the accident with only minimal damage. "It should be consumed while it maintains temperature." "Yes, I faltered, and I never faltered. I was someone who conducted interviews with hostile subjects and extracted information from unwilling sources. I didn't stumble over basic social courtesies with strangers. "Thank you for bringing it. That was unexpected." He moved further into my living room, and the space seemed to contract around him. Not because he was particularly large, though he was tall and broad-shouldered in a way that suggested deliberate physical conditioning. The contraction happened because of how completely present he was, how entirely he occupied the space he moved through. There was no part of him that seemed uncomfortable or unfamiliar with the act of standing in someone else's home uninvited. "I didn't catch your name," I said. And it was a question phrased as a statement, a journalist's technique designed to prompt response without directly interrogating. He set the delivery bag on my kitchen counter, movements deliberate and controlled. When he turned back to face me, his dark eyes contained something that might have been amusement at my attempt at information extraction. "Gabriel," he said simply. No surname offered, which was its own form of communication. "And you are Olivia Richardson." The fact that he knew my name didn't shock me immediately. It should have. Instead, I found myself processing it as simply one more piece of information that required categorization. Of course he knew my name. He'd come to my house. He'd deliberately brought me my food delivery. He'd conducted some form of advanced research or maintained access to information that made knowing such details effortless. "How do you know my name?" I asked, though the answer was becoming obvious even as I formulated the question. "I know everything that happens in my territory," he said. And there it was again. That word, territory. He wasn't using it casually or metaphorically. Territory was something he administered, something he controlled, something that included the quiet suburban street where my house sat among other people's houses, all of us believing we inhabited private spaces, when in fact we occupied whatever land this man had decided to claim. I moved to the dining table, not as an invitation but as a repositioning, a way of reclaiming some element of authority within my own space. I gestured to the chair across from me, and Gabriel sat without being invited to sit, which told me everything I needed to know about the dynamic we were establishing here. "The accident outside," I said. "The motorcycle driver. Who was he?" "Someone who made an error," Gabriel responded. He was watching my face with an intensity that suggested he was gathering information with the same precision I used to gather information. "His injury has been addressed. His situation is resolved." The way he said "resolved" contained layers of implication that I didn't want to examine too closely. Resolved could mean hospitalized. Resolved could mean paid off. Resolved could mean many things, and most of them involved Gabriel making decisions about other people's futures without those people having input into the process. "You seem like someone who has questions," Gabriel continued. "And it wasn't a request for confirmation. I would prefer that you ask them now rather than having them asked through intermediaries later. This was a test." I recognized it as such because I'd conducted similar tests myself, creating situations where people had to choose between dangerous honesty and calculated deception, and their choice revealed something essential about them. Gabriel was doing that now with me, establishing that I could ask him things directly, or I could find out through other means, and the direct approach was preferable. "Who are you?" I asked. And it was a broader question than it appeared to be. Not asking for a name or occupation, but asking what category of person I was now sitting across from in my dining room. A businessman, he said without hesitation. Someone involved in various enterprises within Chicago. Someone who takes responsibility for the things that happen within his jurisdiction. What kind of businessman? I pressed. And this was where I could feel the conversation shifting into territory that might be regrettable. But I'd made a choice to ask directly, and backing away now would only signal weakness. Gabriel considered the question for a moment. He glanced around my living room, taking in the detail of my research, the papers I'd been working on, the evidence of my profession written across my domestic space. The kind that doesn't concern people like you, he finally said. The kind that operates beyond the scope of what newspapers care about, or what police care about. The kind that manages resources and territories, and maintains order within defined parameters. Crime. He was describing crime in language that obscured the specifics, while making the general framework perfectly clear. He was organized, he was established. He was someone for whom these activities were normal infrastructure, rather than deviation from normalcy. And if I told you I was interested in your business dealings, I said, and I could see something shift in his expression, some microscopic change that suggested I'd said something he hadn't anticipated. I would suggest that interest in my business dealings could be unwise, he said carefully, not because of any direct threat, but because of the attention it might attract. From people other than myself. From people considerably less patient than I am. There was warning in that statement, but it wasn't the warning of someone making an empty threat. It was the warning of someone who understood consequences and was attempting to prevent a chain reaction that would become difficult to manage. I do investigation work, I said, and I was making a calculated choice to be honest because honesty had performed better in this conversation than deflection had. I pursue stories. I research financial structures. I occasionally publish articles about things that most people prefer to remain unknown. Yes, Gabriel said, and the certainty in that single word indicated that he already knew this about me, that he'd known it before entering my house, that my profession and my methods and my particular capacity for information gathering had all been assessed and analyzed before we'd exchanged a single word. That's precisely why I'm going to suggest that you remain focused on stories that don't involve my organization. What if I decide not to? I asked. And it was a provocative question, calculated to establish whether Gabriel was the type to make threats or the type to explain consequences. He stood, and the moment felt significant. Like a door that had been open for conversation was beginning to close. He moved toward my kitchen counter where he'd set the food delivery, and I realized he was preparing to leave. Whatever he'd wanted to accomplish here, he'd accomplished it. The exchange had served its purpose. Then you'd discover certain facts about how information flows, he said, and his hand was on the door handle. You'd learn that some stories attract attention you don't want. You'd find that sources dry up, that editors suddenly become very risk-averse, that the architecture of investigation becomes significantly more complicated when you're working against an organization rather than for yourself. He paused, and the pause was deliberate, was meant to allow the implication to settle. Not because I would do anything directly, he continued, but because people within my organization operate according to patterns that you would simply discover as the natural consequence of pursuing stories you shouldn't pursue. The choice is yours, but choose carefully. And then he was gone, disappearing into the rain the way he'd emerged from it. I stood in my doorway, watching his silhouette disappear into the darkness of the suburban night. The Maserati was still against the utility pole, evidence of collision and chaos that had somehow resolved itself into this encounter in my living room. I closed the door and moved immediately to my kitchen. The food had cooled but remained in reasonable condition. I ate mechanically, my mind entirely elsewhere. Then I returned to my dining table, to the papers and the laptop and the research that had constituted my world for the past several hours. I pulled up a search engine. I typed the name Gabriel with no surname, understanding that surnames might be concealed or false or significant in ways I couldn't yet parse. I added Maserati to narrow the search. I added Chicago. I added Italian. I added businessman, criminal, organized. The search results were sparse initially. mostly articles about car accidents or unrelated individuals named Gabriel. But I persisted. I started searching for Italian surnames that appeared in crime contexts in Chicago. I searched for families, organizations, syndicates, anything that might connect to the man who had stood in my living room and warned me away from investigation. And there, buried in a forum dedicated to organized crime history, I found it. Marino. Familia Marino, one of Chicago's established crime organizations, operating since the 1970s. Leadership changed through succession and elimination and adaptation, but the organization persisted. And according to the forum posts authored by people with varying degrees of credibility and paranoia, the current leader of Familia Marino was someone named Gabriel. No surname provided, just Gabriel. Just authority sufficient that a single name sufficed to identify the man who controlled a significant portion of criminal infrastructure in Chicago. I sat back from my laptop, my hands resting on the table in front of me. The food I'd eaten sat in my stomach like a stone. The implications of what I'd just learned were cascading outward in directions that I didn't want to follow, but couldn't seem to resist. Gabriel Marino, the man who had delivered my food, the man who had warned me away from investigation, the man who controlled a territory that apparently included my suburban house and my quiet street and my private research, the man who was Ricchetti's superior in whatever organizational structure I'd been investigating for the past several weeks. I stood up and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain slightly. The street outside was empty now, except for the utility pole and the wrecked Maserati. The rain continued its steady percussion against the glass. And somewhere out there in the darkness, Gabriel Marino was conducting his business, managing his territories, maintaining the order he'd mentioned so casually in my living room. I'd made a significant error in judgment by pursuing the Renaissance biologics story. I understood that now with crystalline clarity. I wasn't investigating biotech company theft. I was peripherally investigating organized crime, without having recognized the investigation for what it actually was. And now that I'd made that connection, the question became whether Gabriel's warning was genuine threat or merely courtesy, and whether my obligation to pursue the truth was more powerful than my obligation to preserve my own safety. I closed the curtain and returned to my table. I stared at my research materials, at the papers and notes and connections that had seemed so important hours ago. They looked different now. Everything looked different now. I had no answer yet to the question of what I would do with this information, but I understood with absolute certainty that nothing about my investigation was going to proceed as I'd planned. The 6 days following Gabriel's departure from my house moved with a velocity that felt disconnected from clock time. Days condensed into research marathons where sleep became an afterthought, sustenance something I consumed without tasting, and the boundary between investigation and obsession dissolved completely. I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. I was pursuing something that had shifted from academic curiosity into something closer to compulsion, driven by the need to understand exactly what I'd stumbled into when I ordered that delivery of Pad Krapow Guy. I spent the first 2 days compiling everything I could access about Familia Marino. Public records, corporate filings, news articles from the past 4 decades, scattered references in academic papers about organized crime structure, forum posts from people who seemed to possess varying levels of actual knowledge and paranoid speculation. The organization had roots stretching back to the 1970s, though some sources suggested the infrastructure extended further back to the 1960s and beyond. They operated primarily through legitimate businesses, construction companies, import-export operations, real estate holdings, restaurant chains, delivery services. The legitimate operations formed a facade behind which other operations moved like water through porous stone. I called Detective Stevens on the morning of day 3, my voice rough from disuse and my eyes gritty from extended screen exposure. He answered on the 3rd ring with his characteristic lack of greeting. "I need more information," I said without preamble. "On Marino, on the organization structure, on operations." "That's not a conversation we're having over an open line," Stevens responded, and the wariness in his tone suggested he'd already anticipated this call. "Then when are we having it?" "We're not. You're going to listen to me instead. I did some checking on your little inquiry. The people involved in that biotech situation you were asking about. They're connected to Marino's operations. Not directly. Several layers removed, but the connection exists. I sat down on the edge of my bed, processing this confirmation of what I'd already begun to suspect. What kind of operations? The kind where asking questions attracts attention you don't want. I'm going to suggest very strongly that you stop asking questions. Full stop. No more inquiry. No more research. No more attempts to connect dots that don't need connecting. Stevens, if there's criminal enterprise involved in intellectual property theft, there's criminal enterprise involved in everything, he interrupted. But not everything is your business to investigate. This falls into that category. Let it go. I didn't let it go. After disconnecting from Stevens, I did the opposite of heeding his warning. I intensified my research. I cross-referenced financial documents I'd previously acquired with databases of organized crime that I'd built up over years of journalism. I contacted sources I had in the financial sector, people who owed me favors, or who were motivated by money to share information about transactions that fell outside normal parameters. I began to construct a map of Renaissance Biologics funding sources that traced backward through shell corporations and investment structures designed specifically to obscure the origins of capital. And as I mapped those structures, something unexpected began to emerge. The funding for Renaissance Biologics, when traced through the maze of corporate formations, didn't originate from criminals attempting to launder money. That would have been the obvious conclusion, the narrative I'd expected to support. Instead, the funding appeared to originate from Marino's organization, but for a purpose that didn't align with typical money laundering. The research itself wasn't being conducted for organized crime benefit. Instead, the research was being conducted by Renaissance Biologics, which appeared to be an entirely legitimate operation, and Marino's organization was simply investing in the company as one might invest in any profitable enterprise. On day 4, I called my contact at the biotech company, the junior accountant named Jennifer who'd provided me with the financial documents in the first place. "I have another question," I said when she answered, her voice immediately tightening with the awareness that this conversation might be moving into territory she regretted having entered. "I don't know if I can answer more questions," she said carefully. "Just one. Who approached your company about investment? Who proposed the capital infusion?" There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, could sense her calculating whether answering this final question would resolve her guilt or compound it. "A woman named Bianca," she finally said. "She represented an investment group. She said they believed in the research and wanted to see it accelerated. She was extremely professional. There was nothing about her that suggested anything criminal. She just seemed like someone investing in something she believed would be profitable. Bianca. A name. A person who worked within Marino's organization, apparently, but who moved through the business world in a capacity that bore no obvious relation to organized crime beyond the capital source. I thanked Jennifer and ended the call, understanding that this would be our last conversation. She'd provided what she was comfortable providing, and asking for more would only compromise her further. What I was discovering didn't match the narrative I'd constructed. Marino's organization wasn't stealing intellectual property and laundering the proceeds. Marino's organization was investing in legitimate research because the research itself promised profitability. It was enterprise. It was capitalism. It was business conducted by people for whom the distinction between legal and illegal operations had become academically interesting rather than practically relevant. On day 5, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered hesitantly, and Gabriel's voice emerged from the other end with a calm that suggested he'd been expecting me to be available when he called, as if my schedule had already been coordinated with his intentions. "You've been asking questions about my organization," he said without preamble. "I'd prefer if you asked them directly to me, rather than through intermediaries who are becoming nervous about your inquiries." "How do you know?" "How I know is irrelevant. What's relevant is that you've discovered enough to be dangerous to people who don't appreciate danger, and I want to prevent that. So I'm offering you an opportunity to acquire accurate information, rather than continuing to work from incomplete data that's been compromised by sources with their own agendas." "People like Detective Stevens?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Stevens is a police officer who operates within legal parameters. That parameters involve certain accommodations with my organization, But his primary commitment is still ostensibly to law enforcement. The people who've been feeding you information about Marino are competitors. They want to discredit the organization. They want to position me as a criminal threatening legitimate operations, when the reality is considerably more nuanced. I sat in silence, processing this conversation. Why would you tell me this? Because you're intelligent enough to eventually figure it out on your own, and having you arrive at the truth through your own investigation might result in publication that I'd have to address through less pleasant means. It's more efficient to provide context and allow you to make informed decisions. And if I continue investigating, then people will begin to experience difficulties, not because I've orchestrated them, but because my competitors will. They'll view your investigation as leverage against me, and they'll use it as such. You'll find your sources drying up. You'll find editors becoming risk-averse. You'll discover that publishing anything about Marino becomes exponentially more difficult. This won't be because I've threatened anyone. This will be the natural consequence of pursuing stories that intersect with interests larger than yours. He paused, and the pause was clearly calculated to let the implications settle. Or, he continued, you could visit my offices and hear directly from me what Familia Marino actually is and how it operates. And then you could make informed decisions about what deserves investigation. And if I refuse both options, then you'll discover the first scenario plays out approximately as I've described. I ended the call without committing to any course of action, but I already knew what I was going to do. I was going to stop investigating Familia Marino. I was going to abandon the article. I was going to acknowledge that I'd been pursuing a story based on contaminated data provided by sources with their own agendas, and that publishing anything would make me a tool for people whose intentions were worse than Gabriel's. It took me 2 days to fully accept this decision. 2 days of sitting with the articles I'd drafted, the research I'd compiled, the potential story that could have rebuilt my career if I'd been willing to overlook the fundamental problem with the sourcing. 2 days of acknowledging that everything I'd believed about journalistic obligation had collided with the reality that journalism conducted without integrity becomes propaganda. On day 6, I sent an email to Detective Stevens and Detective Roberts. The email was brief and didn't elaborate on specifics. I wrote, I need to withdraw from our arrangement. I have a conflict of interest that makes it impossible for me to continue working as an informational resource. I appreciate the assistance you've provided, and I hope you understand that this decision is necessary. Neither of them responded, which was the appropriate response. They understood implicitly that I'd discovered something about the landscape that required me to change my positioning within it. Maintaining contact with police investigators while pursuing the Marino investigation had created exactly the kind of conflict of interest I'd mentioned. By cutting ties, I was protecting both of them and myself. On the evening of day 6, another envelope arrived. Unlike the first, which had been left under my door by Gabriel himself, this one was delivered by someone who knocked and then disappeared before I could process that I was opening the door. I found the envelope on my porch, my name written on it in precise handwriting that I didn't recognize. Inside were photographs, 6 of them. Each one showed me in locations I'd visited over the past several days. Me at the coffee shop where I'd met Stevens to discuss the Renaissance biologic situation. Me outside an office building where I'd conducted an interview with a journalist who'd previously written about organized crime in Chicago. Me in the park near my house, sitting alone on a bench, absorbed in thought. The images were professional in their composition and clarity. They'd been taken by someone who understood photography and surveillance equally well. Beneath the photographs was a handwritten note on expensive stationery. Simply so, you understand I can. Dinner tomorrow at 8. Ristorante Luciano, downtown Chicago. Your name will be at the reservation. There was no signature, though the message was unmistakably from Gabriel. The photographs were his statement of position. You are observed. You are known. Your movements are tracked. And simultaneously, beneath that statement existed another message. I control the flow of information about you. I could distribute these. I could use them. But instead, I'm offering dinner. I spent the rest of the evening selecting what to wear to a dinner with a man I was increasingly certain was the head of organized crime in Chicago. I chose a dress in deep green. The color I'd been told years ago complemented my eyes. I chose simple jewelry, I chose not to appear as if I was making an effort, which paradoxically required significant effort to achieve. I chose to appear as someone who simply existed in the world without attempting to impress it. At 7:45 p.m., I was driving downtown toward Restaurant Luciano, my hands steady on the steering wheel, my heart rate elevated despite my best efforts to maintain composure. I was walking toward something significant. I was making a choice that would have consequences. And unlike the choice to stop investigating, this choice felt less like retreat and more like forward motion, even though I couldn't have articulated exactly where that motion was leading. 3 weeks into whatever this had become, I understood that the comfortable distance I'd attempted to maintain between myself and Gabriel's world was no longer viable. The distance had collapsed silently, without announcement, the way that distance collapses when you begin sleeping in someone's apartment and taking your meals in his spaces and allowing his concerns to intersect with your own consciousness at moments when you weren't actively guarding against it. The apartment he kept downtown occupied an entire floor of a building that looked anonymous from the street, but revealed itself as something considerably more sophisticated once you passed through the reinforced doors. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Chicago's downtown core. The furnishings were minimal, expensive, carefully curated by someone with specific taste and no interest in appearing wealthy. The kitchen contained equipment designed for someone who understood cooking as precision rather than creativity. The bedroom was dominated by a bed that cost more than my first car, dressed in linens that felt obscene against my skin. Gabriel had moved me there on the afternoon that the enforcer named Dominic was shot outside a legitimate business that Marino used as a front for money management operations. The shooting happened at 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. Dominic had been performing routine surveillance when the bullet entered his shoulder from an angle that suggested professional marksmanship. Not fatal. Not intended to be fatal. It was a message. And the message was that Verziani's organization had moved beyond territorial posturing into active violence. I'd been at my house working when Gabriel called. His voice had contained none of the controlled civility he typically maintained in conversation with me. "You need to leave," he said. "Now. Pack what you need. My driver will arrive in 30 minutes. What's happened?" "An incident. One of my people was targeted. Not lethally, but the intent is clear. I need you somewhere secure until I determine the scope of this situation." I'd packed without asking further questions, understanding that asking would only delay whatever he'd already decided needed to happen. The driver, a man named Franco who wore an earpiece and moved with the practiced awareness of someone trained in threat assessment, had driven me downtown while Gabriel handled whatever required handling in the immediate aftermath of violence. Gabriel arrived at the apartment at 11:47 p.m. He'd showered somewhere else, changed into clean clothes, but his energy carried a quality of controlled brutality that made the air feel different when he occupied it. His dark eyes held something that wasn't quite anger, but was definitely adjacent to it. "Verziani," he said without preamble, moving to the window that overlooked the city. "He's decided to escalate beyond territorial disputes. Who is Verziani?" I asked, though the name had begun to accumulate context in my mind. Victor Verziani, Russian-Ukrainian syndicate, rivals to Marino's organization. I'd encountered references to him in my research weeks ago before Gabriel had warned me away from investigation. "Competition," Gabriel said, and something in how he said the word suggested that competition was too gentle a term for what they actually represented to each other. His organization operates through different channels, more violence, less structure, less code. He's been pushing into my territories for 6 months, testing boundaries, seeing where I'll respond, and where I'll acquiesce. And will you acquiesce? Gabriel turned from the window. His expression had shifted into something harder, more certain. "No, I won't." But Verziani doesn't believe that yet. He believes that he can apply pressure and that pressure will eventually break something. He's wrong. But the process of proving him wrong will create situations that require you to be somewhere protected. I moved to the kitchen, my hands moving through the motions of making coffee because standing still felt impossible. The apartment was so quiet around us that the coffee maker's gurgle sounded obscenely loud. "You need to understand something," Gabriel continued, and I could hear him moving through the space toward where I stood. "My world operates according to specific rules. Those rules exist to prevent exactly what's happening now. Verciani is choosing to ignore those rules, which means I'm going to have to remind him why the rules exist. How? I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. Through methods that are not your concern, he said, and his hand came to rest on my shoulder, the touch grounding me in a way that I didn't want to acknowledge. What is your concern is remaining safe while I address this situation. Over the next 72 hours, I watched as Gabriel conducted his response to Verciani's provocation. He didn't do this from the apartment. He left in the mornings and returned in the evenings, his energy fluctuating between focused intensity and something like exhaustion. I didn't ask what he was doing. I understood that asking would only create complications for both of us. What I learned came through secondary sources. News reports mentioned a fire at a commercial property in the warehouse district. Another report referenced an incident at a distribution center that resulted in 3 hospitalizations. A third article mentioned unexplained damage to a nightclub that Verciani apparently had financial interest in. The incidents weren't connected in any official capacity, but the timeline and the geography created a pattern that suggested coordination. On the 4th night, after Gabriel had returned and showered, and I'd managed to convince him to eat something, I finally called my mother. I hadn't intended to. The decision emerged from some part of me that recognized I was entering territory where isolation would become dangerous, where not having human connections outside of Gabriel's world would leave me with no reference point for what normal actually looked like. She answered on the 2nd ring, her voice carrying that particular quality of surprise mixed with wariness that people use when someone they've been waiting for finally contacts them. "Olivia," she said, and just my name contained questions and concerns and hurt accumulated over 8 months of silence. "Hi," I said, and the word felt insufficient for everything it needed to contain. "I'm sorry I haven't called." "I'm not going to pretend that wasn't difficult," my mother responded, but her voice had shifted into the tone she used when she was choosing honesty over accusation. "What's changed?" I sat on the edge of Gabriel's bed, looking out at the city lights below, trying to articulate why I'd suddenly needed to bridge the distance I'd created. "I made an error," I said carefully, "in my research. I was pursuing a story based on information provided by people with agendas I didn't fully understand, and I nearly published something that would have been fundamentally dishonest." There was a pause. "My mother is a lawyer. She understands implications and subtext the way that most people understand language. Did you publish it?" she asked. "No," I stopped. I recognized the problem before reaching the point of no return. Another pause. "That's growth," she finally said. "That's not something you would have done 3 years ago. I also discovered that I've been somewhat isolated," I continued, and the words felt like confession. "I've built a life where I don't maintain relationships outside of my work, and I think that isolation compromised my judgment about what questions were important to ask and what stories actually deserved investigation. Are you saying you're coming back to Boston?" "No," I said, and I meant it, but I'm saying I want to maintain contact with you. I'm saying I recognize that you and Dad were trying to protect me even when I interpreted that as judgment." My mother's voice shifted again, into something close to tears, but controlled with the precision of someone who understood that crying would only complicate conversation. "I want to hear more," she said, "but I also want you to know that your father and I are proud of you, even when we were worried, even when we didn't understand your choices. That pride didn't stop existing just because we were afraid." We talked for another hour. We didn't resolve everything that had fractured between us, but we created space for resolution to eventually occur. We established that I would call weekly. We discussed the possibility of her visiting Chicago. We created the scaffolding for rebuilding what isolation had damaged. When I ended the call, Gabriel was standing in the doorway watching me with an expression I couldn't immediately categorize. "Your family," he said. It wasn't a question. "My mother," I confirmed. "I haven't spoken to her in 8 months. But you have now." "Yes." Gabriel moved into the room and sat beside me, his presence taking up space in a way that was becoming increasingly familiar. "Isolation compromises judgment," he said, and I realized he'd been listening to my entire conversation, despite maintaining the courtesy of appearing occupied elsewhere. I learned that early. In my position, it's easy to believe that you don't need people outside your organization. That connection creates vulnerability. But isolation creates a different kind of vulnerability. It makes you dependent on only the perspectives available within your immediate circle. It removes alternative reference points. Is that a criticism of how I've been living? No, Gabriel said. It's an observation. I've spent 20 years in isolation by choice. I became skilled at maintaining power and control within that isolation, but I wonder sometimes if I've sacrificed things that isolation made impossible to preserve. I didn't ask him to elaborate on what those things might be. I understood that some conversations required more foundation than we'd constructed, required more certainty about what we actually were to each other before they could be productively conducted. Instead, I sat in silence with him, watching the city below continue its evening progression, understanding that whatever was happening between Gabriel and Verciani's organization was ongoing and would continue in the background of everything else. That violence and consequence and the architecture of criminal enterprise would persist, regardless of whether I acknowledged it or understood it, or wished it away. The apartment felt less like a cage now than it had when I first arrived. It felt more like what it actually was, a space where two people with fundamentally different lives were attempting to create intersection points that neither of them fully understood, but both of them seemed increasingly reluctant to abandon. It had started to feel less like a temporary shelter, and more like a space where I was beginning to understand the architecture of Gabriel's interior landscape, not through direct confession, but through accumulated observation. The books on his shelves were primarily in Italian, leather-bound editions of classics that suggested he'd been reading them for years, rather than acquiring them for decoration. Dante, Boccaccio, Machiavelli. The margins of some were annotated in his precise handwriting, notes in Italian, that I was slowly learning to decipher through combination of context and the Italian I'd absorbed peripherally over the years. There was a photograph on his nightstand that he never acknowledged, but that I'd come to understand was significant. A young Gabriel, maybe 16, standing beside a woman whose face was clearly visible in her son's features. His mother. She had his sharp jawline, his dark eyes, but her expression carried a quality of warmth that I hadn't yet witnessed in Gabriel's expressions. I'd researched enough to understand that she'd died when he was still young, that he'd inherited control of a criminal organization before most people inherit their parents' houses. That context made certain aspects of his personality begin to coalesce into something approaching comprehension. 7 weeks into living in his downtown apartment, Gabriel had finally begun to articulate the structure of his own history with the same precision I used when researching financial crimes. We were in bed, late evening, the city lights creating a perpetual twilight through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was smoking a cigarette, something he did rarely, usually when the weight of decisions had accumulated to a point where nicotine became necessary for processing. My father ran this organization for 32 years, he said without preamble, his accent thickening slightly the way it did when he wasn't actively managing how he presented himself. He was effective. Not innovative, but consistent. He maintained order through combination of violence and mutual respect. People understood where boundaries existed, and what consequences came from crossing them. I listened without interrupting, understanding that interruption would close the door he was opening. My mother died when I was 16, he continued, exhaling smoke into the darkness. Cancer. Aggressive. He was destroyed by it. He stopped managing operations. He stopped being present. 6 months later, his brother attempted to assume control. My father finally recognized that he needed to pass the organization to someone who would preserve it rather than exploit it. I was 18. I'd just finished secondary school. He made his choice. That's a significant responsibility for someone that young, I said carefully. It was, Gabriel agreed. It required me to become something that 18-year-olds aren't typically prepared to become. I had to learn violence. I had to learn negotiation. I had to learn that human beings would betray you for marginal financial gain. I had to learn that sentiment and obligation and family connection could all be sacrificed by people for the right incentive. I had to learn those things quickly. He paused, and the pause was weighted with acknowledgement of cost. I became efficient, he continued. I maintained order. I expanded operations through legitimate channels. I elevated the organization to a level of sophistication that my father never achieved. But I did it in isolation. I didn't permit people into my life. I didn't develop relationships that existed outside of professional context. I created distance between myself and every person I interacted with, because distance is safer than connection when you command an organization that operates through threat assessment. And now? I asked. Now I'm discovering that isolation creates its own form of vulnerability, Gabriel said, and his eyes met mine with an intensity that made breathing feel momentarily complicated. I'm discovering that I've sacrificed things in pursuit of maintaining control that I'm not sure were actually necessary to sacrifice. I'm discovering that having someone present in my space who exists outside the framework of my professional obligations is simultaneously threatening and necessary in ways I didn't anticipate. I moved closer to him, and he set the cigarette aside, his full attention shifting to me with that quality of complete focus that he applied to everything. "Tell me about your vulnerabilities," he said, and it was phrased as a request, but carried the weight of genuine inquiry. So I told him. I told him about the article that hadn't been published, about the career that had collapsed under the weight of incomplete research and sources with hidden agendas. I told him about the boyfriend who had chosen someone else while I was working, about my parents' distance that had eventually transformed into something approaching abandonment. I told him about the years of isolation, that I'd convinced myself was independence, but was actually just fear wearing a professional costume. I built walls, I said, and saying it aloud made it feel more true than it had when I was simply living it. I told myself that vulnerability was weakness, that depending on anyone was a failure, that if I just worked hard enough and researched thoroughly enough and maintained enough control over my own narrative, I could prevent being hurt again. But isolation hurt you anyway, Gabriel observed. Yes, it hurt differently, but it hurt. It just felt safer because I could blame external circumstances instead of blaming myself for choosing isolation. Gabriel's hand came up and brushed a strand of hair from my face, the gesture simple but containing intention that made my chest tighten. "I want to ask you something," I said, "and I want you to answer with complete honesty, because I need to understand what this actually is between us. Are you keeping me here because you genuinely want me here? Or are you keeping me here because I know too much about your organization, and you need to control how that information is managed?" His expression didn't change, but I could feel something shift in his energy, a recalibration as he processed the question. "Both," he finally said. "I want you here. But the fact that I want you here is inseparable from the fact that you represent information that could be dangerous if it dispersed through channels that aren't controlled by me. Those two things exist simultaneously. They're not mutually exclusive. But yes, if you're asking whether I would have pursued this connection if you weren't aware of my organization's existence, the answer is no. The awareness of you came through surveillance. The connection came after that. But the genuine desire to have you present has transcended the original strategic motivation. It was the kind of honesty that most people would consider disqualifying. But I'd learned through years of research that honesty about intention was significantly more valuable than dishonesty about motivation. Gabriel wasn't pretending that this relationship had emerged from pure romantic impulse. He was acknowledging that it had emerged from convergence of surveillance, strategy, and genuine connection. That convergence was complicated, but it was also real. "I want to help you," I said, "not because I'm obligated to, but because I have skills that are actually useful. I can research. I can analyze financial structures. I can identify patterns that people without that training might miss." Gabriel's expression shifted into something that might have been relief, or might have been calculation, or might have been both simultaneously. "I'll consider it," he said, "but only assignments where the risk is minimal. You're not going to become involved in operations where direct exposure to violence is likely." "That's a reasonable boundary," I acknowledged. Over the following week, I began to move through Gabriel's professional world in a different capacity. I wasn't investigating him. I was working alongside him, analyzing investment structures for his legitimate business operations, identifying patterns in financial flows that suggested inefficiency or risk. It was work that I was actually good at, that used skills I'd developed over years of journalism, but in a context where the goal was optimization rather than exposure. My mother visited Chicago on a Saturday in mid-November. I'd invited her cautiously, uncertain how to integrate the worlds she inhabited and the world I'd moved into. Gabriel had arranged for us to meet at a restaurant that was neutral territory, expensive enough to feel significant, but not so formally intimidating that conversation would become impossible. She arrived wearing the practical elegance she'd always favored, her expression containing the particular quality of assessment that people use when they're attempting to understand their child's life, without judgment. Gabriel appeared for the latter part of the meal, having engineered the encounter so that he could observe us together and then participate in conversation in a way that suggested casualness he didn't feel. "So you're the man my daughter has become involved with," my mother said without preamble, her attorney's directness immediately establishing the tone of the conversation. "I am," Gabriel confirmed. "I'm aware that her career and her living situation have changed significantly. I thought it important to meet with you and acknowledge that those changes are my responsibility." My mother's eyebrow lifted slightly, a gesture that indicated she'd just revised her assessment of him upward. "She doesn't talk about what you do," my mother said. "She knows what I do," Gabriel said carefully. "The specifics aren't something she needs detailed knowledge of, but she understands the general framework. And you're treating her well?" "I am," Gabriel said. And there was something in how he said it that made it clear this wasn't a question he was going to deflect. "Probably better than I know how to treat anyone. But yes, I'm treating her as well as my capacity allows." My mother looked at me, and her expression contained a complexity of emotions that I could read because I'd spent a lifetime learning her face. "You're happy?" she asked. "I'm happy," I confirmed. "It's complicated. It's not what I expected my life to look like. But yes, I'm happy." "Your father will worry," she said. "I know, but I think," my mother continued. And she was looking at Gabriel now with an expression that was approaching approval. "I think you're going to be fine." After my mother left the city, I called my father for the first time in almost a year. The conversation was brief and somewhat awkward, but it was a conversation, which was infinitely better than the silence that had preceded it. He said he was proud of me for stopping the article that would have been fundamentally dishonest. He said he and my mother would like to visit again. He said he loved me, which he said the way people say important things when they haven't said them in a long time and aren't sure they'll get another opportunity. The apartment still contained all the elements of Gabriel's professional isolation, but it had begun to feel less like a fortress and more like a space where two people with fundamentally incompatible backgrounds had decided to attempt convergence. It was terrifying in ways that I couldn't fully articulate, but it was also something that neither of us seemed capable of abandoning, which suggested that sometimes the most significant things in life emerge from precisely the kind of risk that all your training tells you to avoid. The poolside at Gabriel's apartment complex had become a ritual for me. Saturday mornings, while he handled business calls, I would swim, attempting to maintain some semblance of physical discipline in a life that had otherwise abandoned conventional structure. The water was heated to an almost obscene temperature, and the isolation of the indoor facility meant I rarely encountered other residents. This particular Saturday in late November felt like it might be the last comfortable one before Chicago's winter became genuinely hostile. I'd been in the water for perhaps 20 minutes when I noticed the absence of my usual security detail. Not the obvious men in suits that stationed themselves throughout the building, but the subtle presence I'd learned to identify. The particular quality of attention that Gabriel's people maintained when monitoring my movements. The attention was gone, replaced by what felt like a vacuum of oversight that immediately triggered every instinct I'd developed about threat assessment. I should have reported it immediately. Instead, I pulled myself from the water, dried off, and returned to Gabriel's apartment to call him. The call went to voicemail, which was unusual enough to register as significant. Gabriel's phone was typically answered on the first ring. His voicemail suggested either deliberate unavailability or a situation that required his complete attention elsewhere. When I returned to the apartment, the door was slightly ajar. Not broken, not forced. Simply open in a way that suggested someone had used a key, and the casual nature of the entry was infinitely more terrifying than any violent breach would have been. They were professionals. 3 men in business casual clothing that was designed to be unremarkable. One of them stepped forward with the kind of controlled politeness that suggested this operation had been carefully planned, and they'd been given explicit instructions about how to conduct it. "Miss Richardson," the man said, and his accent placed him somewhere in the Russian or Ukrainian demographic. "We need you to come with us. No resistance necessary. You'll be completely unharmed if you cooperate fully." I could have run. The apartment had multiple exits, but running would only complicate things, and I'd already understood on some level that this was going to happen, that the equilibrium Gabriel and I had constructed was going to be tested against the actual stakes of his world. "Where are we going?" I asked, and my voice was steady despite my heart rate accelerating into territory that felt medically questionable. "Somewhere secure," the man responded. "Somewhere where you can have a conversation with my employer. He's very interested in understanding your relationship with Gabriel Marino." They drove me to a warehouse in an industrial district that I didn't recognize. The building itself was nondescript, the kind of structure that existed throughout Chicago's manufacturing zones without anyone paying particular attention to its specific function. Inside, the space was largely empty, utilitarian. Concrete floors, metal support beams, a single room that had been converted into something approximating an office space. Victor Verciani was waiting. He was older than I'd anticipated, maybe mid-50s, with the particular quality of physical presence that comes from being someone who'd survived decades in an organization that preferred to resolve conflicts through violence. He was sitting at a card table when they brought me in, drinking coffee from a paper cup like he wasn't actively engaged in criminal kidnapping. "Olivia Richardson," he said, and he said my name like he was reading from a prepared document. "Gabriel Marino's new, what is the word? Companion? You're a curious choice for someone in his position. A journalist, a woman with significant investigative skills, a person whose primary training is in information gathering and distribution." "I stopped investigating," I said, because it seemed relevant. "I stopped pursuing stories about your organizations weeks ago." Victor smiled, and the expression transformed his face into something considerably more dangerous than his neutral demeanor had suggested. "Yes. Gabriel convinced you to stop. Explained that investigation would create complications. Assured you that your cooperation would keep you safe. All very logical. All very compelling to someone who doesn't understand the actual architecture of how these situations function." He stood and moved closer. "And I understood that this was a display of dominance, that the physical proximity was calculated to establish hierarchy through space management. I want you to understand something," Victor continued. "Gabriel knows you're here. He's known since my people first began planning this operation. He allowed it to happen. He's allowed it to happen because he wants to address a problem, and I'm useful to him as a problem to address. You, however, are simply the mechanism. You're the leverage. You're the justification for actions he was already planning to take." "That's not true," I said. But my voice had changed, had taken on a quality of uncertainty that I hadn't intended to communicate. "It is true," Victor said with absolute certainty. "Gabriel Marino operates through a specific methodology. He gathers information. He allows situations to develop to the point where they become manageable. Then he addresses them with overwhelming force. You're the development phase. I'm providing him with justification and opportunity." Over the next several hours, Victor conducted what could charitably be called an interview, but was more accurately a monologue about Gabriel's organization, about how Marino had systematically eliminated competitors, about how the current territorial arrangement had been established through combination of violence and strategic patience. Victor talked like someone who'd been waiting for an audience, like he had arguments he needed to articulate and hadn't had the opportunity to articulate them previously. It was during one of these monologues, while Victor was describing a specific conflict with Marino's organization from 3 years prior, that the violence began. Gabriel arrived with a precision that suggested he'd been monitoring the warehouse location throughout my captivity. The assault was controlled and efficient in a way that suggested military training. No hesitation, no mercy. Just systematic elimination of threat through application of superior force. Victor died approximately 40 minutes after Gabriel's arrival. He died from a combination of injuries that Gabriel and his people had inflicted, and from the deliberate withholding of medical attention that would have prevented the cumulative trauma from becoming fatal. He died sitting in that warehouse office, bleeding from multiple locations, while Gabriel stood nearby with the composed expression of someone watching an inevitability resolve itself. When Gabriel finally approached me, his clothes were soaked through with blood that wasn't all his own. His expression contained something that I recognized as satisfaction, but that also carried undertones of something considerably more complex. "Come," he said simply. "We need to leave." The car ride back to the apartment was conducted in silence. Gabriel showered while I attempted to process what had occurred, attempted to reconcile the man I'd been building connection with over weeks of intimate proximity with the man I'd just watched conduct systematic violence against a business rival. When he emerged from the shower, I finally asked the question that had been accumulating since Victor had first suggested it. "Did you know?" I asked. "About the kidnapping? About the plan?" Gabriel didn't deny it. Instead, he sat beside me and explained with the kind of matter-of-fact precision that made everything worse than actual denial would have. "Yes," he said. "I knew. My informants had provided intelligence suggesting that Versiani was planning to move against me through you. I had two options. I could strengthen your security to the point where the attempt would fail visibly, which would demonstrate that you were my weakness and potentially invite more sophisticated attacks. Or I could allow the attempt to proceed, create an environment where I could control the escalation and eliminate the problem permanently." "You used me as bait," I said, and the words felt like they were being spoken by someone else, like I was observing this conversation from a distance. "Yes," Gabriel confirmed. "I did, and I acknowledge that this was not a decision I made with your input or consent. But it was a decision that I made to protect you and to eliminate a threat that was becoming increasingly dangerous. Had I simply retaliated after Versiani's initial aggression, it would have appeared reactive. By allowing his plan to proceed and then responding with overwhelming force, it becomes clear that any further attempts would be futile. I don't know how to exist with that," I said honestly. "I don't know how to maintain connection with someone who would position me in danger without informing me of the danger or asking my consent." Gabriel was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had changed, had taken on a quality of genuine vulnerability. "I don't know how to operate differently," he finally said. "This is how I've been trained to think about problems. This is the methodology I've used for 20 years to maintain control and eliminate threats. I'm not certain I'm capable of changing that methodology, but I'm willing to attempt it, if you're willing to remain." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I sat with the complexity of what had occurred, with the reality that Gabriel had endangered me deliberately, and with the equally real reality that he'd eliminated a threat that would have continued to escalate. Both things were true simultaneously, and that simultaneity was what made the situation so fundamentally difficult to navigate. "I need time," I finally said. "I need time to process this. I need time to determine whether I can actually trust that you won't do this again." Gabriel nodded, accepting the boundary I'd established without argument. And in the silence that followed, I understood that whatever happened next would determine whether this connection could actually survive beyond the initial intensity that had driven it into existence. The apartment bathroom had never felt quite so vulnerable as it did when Gabriel filled the tub with hot water and gently helped me into it. I was still wearing my clothes from the warehouse, though he'd already removed his own, and the contrast between my fully dressed state and his bare skin created an absurdity that matched the surreality of the entire situation. He didn't speak as he carefully peeled away my soaked garments, treating my body with a gentleness that seemed incompatible with the violence he'd just conducted. The water was scalding, almost painful against my skin, but I welcomed the sensation because it was real and immediate, and didn't require me to process anything beyond the physical discomfort. "I'm going to stay here," Gabriel said, and it wasn't a request. He pulled a chair to the edge of the tub and sat, maintaining a distance that suggested he understood I needed space, even as he remained present. "I need you to understand that everything that occurred was calculated. Everything." "I know," I said, and my voice sounded distant even to myself. "That's what makes it worse. It's not a crime of passion or necessity. It's strategic. It's business." "It is business," Gabriel confirmed. "It's also protection. It's also elimination of a threat that would have continued escalating until someone died." It's also establishing precedent about what happens when people attempt to use you against me. I leaned back into the water, allowing it to cover everything except my face. The heat was beginning to penetrate the numbness that had settled over my shock. Did you ever consider that I might not want to be protected that way? I asked. That using me as leverage might not be the only option available? I considered it, Gabriel said. And I made a choice. A choice that I made without your input or consent. A choice that I now understand you're going to require me to justify in ways that I may not be adequately equipped to justify. That's an understatement, I said. But my anger was beginning to crystallize into something more functional than rage. I was angry because I had a right to be angry. But beneath the anger was something more complicated. Beneath it was understanding that Gabriel operated within a framework where certain actions were acceptable and others weren't, and using me as bait fell within the acceptable parameters of his world, even if it violated every parameter I'd constructed for my own. By the time I emerged from the bathtub, wrapping myself in a robe that Gabriel had provided, several hours had passed. It was late evening, and I'd shifted from acute shock into something approximating exhausted acceptance. Gabriel had remained in the chair the entire time, occasionally refilling my water glass or adjusting the temperature of the bath without being asked. It was attentiveness that I recognized as genuine, but that was simultaneously infuriating, because it suggested he believed small kindnesses could offset fundamental violations of autonomy. I was sitting on the bed, wrapped in Gabriel's robe, and feeling smaller than I'd felt in weeks, when my mother arrived at the apartment without warning. Gabriel had apparently called her the moment Verciani's people had taken me, providing her with the address and the situation without embellishment. She came through the door with the particular quality of purposeful movement that I recognized as her default when facing crises that required immediate action. She assessed the situation with the rapid efficiency of someone trained to evaluate evidence and circumstances. She saw me wrapped in a man's robe. She saw Gabriel sitting across from me maintaining careful distance. She understood without needing explanation that something significant had occurred. "Who are you?" she asked Gabriel directly, and there was no warmth in her voice, just professional assessment. "Gabriel Marino," he responded. "Your daughter has been residing with me. She was recently taken by someone who wanted to create leverage against me. I eliminated that person. Your daughter is physically unharmed." My mother's expression shifted through several iterations of processing as she calculated the implications of what he'd just stated. "You're involved in organized crime," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Gabriel confirmed. "I am, and I acknowledge that your daughter has been placed in circumstances that she didn't choose, and that involved risks I orchestrated." My mother crossed to me and sat beside me on the bed, her expression containing layers of concern and assessment, and something approximating anger. "Are you safe?" she asked me directly. "I think so," I said carefully. "Gabriel believes he's eliminated the primary threat, but I'm not naive enough to believe there are no other threats." "Do you want to leave?" my mother asked. I looked at Gabriel, who had remained perfectly still throughout this exchange, and I found myself unable to produce the affirmative response that my mother was clearly hoping for. "No," I said. "I don't want to leave, but I need to establish new parameters. I need to understand that using me without my knowledge or consent isn't acceptable, regardless of the rationale." My mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she turned to Gabriel with the particular intensity that she applied to legal negotiations and adversarial situations. "If you hurt her," my mother said, "if you place her in danger without her explicit knowledge and consent again, I will dedicate my career to ensuring that every crime you've ever committed is prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I have connections. I have resources. And I have nothing to lose if I decide to pursue vengeance on behalf of my daughter. Are we clear?" "Completely," Gabriel said. And there was respect in how he said it. "I understand the boundaries. I accept the consequences." My mother stayed in Chicago for a week. During that week, she observed Gabriel and me together. She reviewed the circumstances of my situation, and she gradually shifted from active hostility into something approximating cautious acceptance. She had lunch with Gabriel. She asked him direct questions about his intentions and his criminal operations. She didn't approve, but she acknowledged that I was making an informed choice to remain. When she left, she hugged me with an intensity that suggested she believed this might be the last time she saw me, and she told me to call her weekly without exception. The weeks that followed moved with a strange normalcy that seemed incompatible with everything that had occurred. Life gradually reassumed patterns. I continued working on financial analysis for Gabriel's legitimate operations. I began quietly contacting some of my journalism sources again, but now with clear boundaries about what I would investigate and what I wouldn't. Gabriel gradually introduced me to people within his organization, not as someone to fear, but as someone who had access to his world and maintained discretion about what she witnessed. 2 months after Versiani's death, I was sitting in a public library researching information about corporate restructuring for one of Gabriel's legitimate businesses when my phone buzzed with a text. Gabriel's message was brief. Incident at Palermo Distribution Center. Need your strategic assessment. Apartment tonight at 8. I packed my materials and responded immediately. Coming for apartment at 7:30. We can discuss over dinner. The drive downtown felt familiar now. The security protocols at the building entrance felt normal. The elevator ride to Gabriel's floor felt routine. When I entered the apartment, Gabriel was already there, documents and photographs spread across the dining table. Coffee prepared the way I preferred it. We worked together until nearly midnight, analyzing the situation from multiple angles, discussing options, constructing strategy. It was work that I was genuinely good at, that used skills I'd developed over years of journalism in a context where the goal was operational optimization rather than exposure or destruction. At one point, Gabriel paused to look at me across the table, and his expression contained something that I'd learned to recognize as genuine affection beneath the layers of strategic calculation that typically defined his demeanor. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" I asked. "For staying. For accepting what I am. For choosing to build something with someone who operates according to logic that most people find incomprehensible." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stood and moved to him, and he pulled me down onto his lap with movements that were becoming increasingly familiar. We sat there in silence, surrounded by documents and photographs, and the architecture of criminal enterprise. And I understood that this was what I'd chosen. Not a simple love story, not a conventional relationship, but something real and complex, and built on mutual understanding of exactly what we were to each other and what we were capable of becoming together. The city lights continued their perpetual display below us, and somewhere in those lights, Gabriel's organization continued its operations according to patterns established over decades. My presence in his life changed nothing about that, but his presence in my life had changed everything. I'd moved from isolation into connection, from fear of vulnerability into acceptance of it, from believing that independence required isolation, into understanding that actual strength sometimes requires trust. We worked until the documents were processed, and the strategy was formalized. Then Gabriel moved toward the kitchen to prepare the simple dinner we'd established as ritual on nights when we worked late. I remained at the table, looking at the city below, understanding that whatever came next would require navigation of terrain that didn't have maps or precedent, but that both of us seemed increasingly willing to traverse together. The choice had been made weeks ago when I decided not to publish the article, but only now, after everything that had occurred, and everything I'd discovered about myself and about Gabriel, did I understand the full weight and meaning of that choice.